The world of 16th century wine. The 16th century. A world of kingdoms and empires, of merchants and monasteries, of peasants working the fields and nobles feasting in their halls. It was a time when wine was more than a drink. It was a way of life. In many parts of Europe, wine flowed daily. For peasants, it was a simple table drink, often mixed with water to stretch its use. For nobles and royalty, it was a symbol of power, refinement, and culture. And in the church, wine held an even deeper meaning. It was sacred, central to rituals that bound communities together. Unlike today, clean water wasn't always guaranteed in the 16th century. Rivers and wells could easily be contaminated. Wine, however, was seen as safer. Its fermentation killed off harmful microbes, making it a trusted companion at every meal. Even children sometimes drank diluted wine, a reminder of just how essential it was to survival. But wine was more than necessity. It was a marker of status. The wealthy flaunted their cellars filled with aged vintages, while travelers stopping at rustic taverns might only taste a rough, freshly pressed brew. Regions competed fiercely, proud of the unique character of their vineyards. Italian wines, French Bordeaux, Spanish sherry, all began carving reputations that still endure today. Yet behind every sip of wine was an ancient craft, a process passed down through generations. From the planting of the first vine to the pouring of the final goblet, making wine in the 16th century was laborious, risky, and deeply tied to nature. It required patience, knowledge, and respect for the land. In this story, we step back 5 centuries to walk through each stage of winemaking as it was done then. From planting vines in the soil, to harvesting grapes under the autumn sun, to crushing, fermenting, aging, and finally, tasting. We'll explore how farmers, monks, and merchants shaped the drink that fueled feasts, prayers, and everyday life. So pour yourself a glass, or imagine one in your hand. This is the world of the 16th century wine. The vineyard, planting and growing grapes. Choosing the land in the 16th century, making wine began long before the first grape was ever pressed. It started with the land. Farmers and monks searched for gentle slopes where sunlight could bathe the vines for much of the day. The soil was carefully judged. Stony earth was prized, for it drained water well and forced the vines to grow strong. In valleys, rich soil produced sweeter grapes, while hilltops offered harsher conditions that gave the wine more character. Preparing the soil. Once the land was chosen, the ground had to be prepared. Men with wooden plows, pulled by oxen or horses, broke the earth. Stones were cleared by hand, stacked into walls that would one day shelter the vines from harsh winds. The soil was left to rest, sometimes for months, before planting began. A rhythm guided by the seasons and by patience. Planting the vines. The vines themselves were precious, often cuttings from older, trusted plants carefully guarded and passed down. Workers dug small holes in neat rows, each one spaced so the vines would not steal strength from one another. The cuttings were pressed into the earth, firmed with bare hands, and tied to wooden stakes for support. It was humble, back-breaking work, but each plant carried the promise of future harvests. Tending through the seasons. From spring to autumn, the vineyard demanded constant care. In spring, new shoots had to be pruned so that only the strongest survived. During summer, vines were trained upward, tied with twine to wooden stakes to keep them off the ground and safe from rot. Children were often sent into the fields to chase away birds and pests that threatened the crop. Every hand in the village, from the youngest to the oldest, had a role in protecting the vines. battling the elements. No vineyard was safe from nature's fury. Too much rain could rot the grapes. Too little, and the vines would wither. A sudden frost could destroy an entire year's work. Farmers turned to prayer, to charms, and to tradition, hoping their harvest would survive the will of the heavens. The promise of the first harvest. By late summer, the vineyard stood as a sea of green, with clusters of grapes slowly darkening under the sun. Each vine was a living investment, a chain between generations. For many families, these grapes were not just food or drink. They were survival, celebration, and livelihood. The vineyard was the beating heart of wine's long journey. The harvest. Grape picking one, the right time to harvest. The moment of harvest was everything. Grapes had to be picked at just the right stage of ripeness. Too early, and the wine would be thin and sour. Too late, and it risked spoiling. In the 16th century, farmers relied not on science but on tradition. They tasted the fruit, chewed the skins, and trusted their senses. Generations of knowledge passed down told them when the time had come. A communal effort. When harvest season arrived, it was not just the vineyard workers who stepped forward, it was the entire community. Families, neighbors, even children joined the effort. The air filled with chatter, laughter, and song as men and women moved through the rows with wicker baskets. It was backbreaking work, but it was also celebration. The vineyard became alive with voices and movement, every hand playing a role in gathering the year's reward. Tools of the harvest. Simple, sharp knives and iron shears were the main tools of the trade. With care, workers clipped clusters of grapes and laid them gently into baskets to avoid bruising the fruit. Each cluster represented months of labor and prayer. Wicker baskets were carried to wooden carts, piled high with the bounty of the fields. Horses and oxen stood waiting, ready to pull the harvest toward the press. The atmosphere of harvest days. Harvest days were more than labor. They were a kind of festival. After hours in the fields, workers shared bread, cheese, and of course wine from the previous year. Musicians sometimes played fiddles or pipes, while children chased one another between the vines. The harvest marked the end of one cycle and the hopeful beginning of another. Even in hard years, the act of gathering grapes carried a sense of gratitude and joy. Transporting the grapes. Once the baskets were filled, they were carefully loaded onto carts. Oxen pulled the harvest slowly along dirt paths, wheels creaking under the weight. Every bump threatened to crush the grapes, so workers balanced the load with skill and care. The journey ended at the wine house or cellar, where the next stage of transformation awaited, the crushing of the fruit. The symbol of harvest for peasants. The harvest meant survival through the coming winter. For nobles, it meant wine to serve at banquets and a symbol of wealth. For monasteries, it meant sacred offerings for Mass. The harvest was more than fruit. It was hope, livelihood, and continuity. With every grape gathered, people carried not just food for the body, but spirit for the soul. The crushing, ancient pressing methods 1. Arrival at the press house. Once the grapes had been picked, they were brought to the wine house, a rustic building of stone and timber, its air thick with the scent of fruit and earth. This was the place where the harvest transformed. Piled high in carts and baskets, the grapes were unloaded, and the press house filled with chatter, sweat, and anticipation. The oldest method, treading by foot. The most ancient way of crushing grapes was the simplest. Large wooden vats were filled to the brim, and barefoot workers stepped inside. Men, women, and even children trampled the grapes in rhythm, their feet stained purple as juice splashed against the sides. Laughter and songs often accompanied the work, for while it was labor, it also carried the joy of tradition. The juice ran through small holes into lower basins where it was gathered for fermentation. The wooden screw press. By the 16th century, another method had become common, the wooden screw press. A massive beam turned by hand forced a heavy plate downward, squeezing grapes against slats of oak. Slowly, thick streams of juice poured into waiting troughs. These presses required strength to operate, but they produced more wine and wasted less fruit than treading alone. The creak of wood and the groan of ropes became the soundtrack of the harvest's second act, separating skins from juice. As the grapes were pressed, juice, skins, and seeds mixed together. Workers strained the liquid through woven baskets or cloths, separating the clear must from the heavy pulp. This step was vital. Too much skin, and the wine would grow harsh and bitter. Too little, and it would lack body. Every decision carried the weight of centuries of trial and error, the atmosphere of the press house. Inside the wine house, the floor ran sticky with juice. The smell of crushed fruit filled the air, sweet and pungent. Torches and candles lit the stone walls, casting flickering shadows over sweating workers. Songs echoed against beams. Prayers whispered that the wine would be strong and pure. The press house was more than a workshop. It was a place where nature and human effort joined in ritual. From fruit to must. By the end of crushing, what had once been clusters of grapes became a thick, foaming liquid. The must, carried in buckets or wooden troughs, it would soon begin the next and most mysterious stage of its journey, fermentation. But in that moment, surrounded by the scent of fresh juice and the hum of voices, the people knew the harvest had been truly gathered, and that wine was at last being born. Fermentation, the transformation into wine, the mystery of fermentation. In the 16th century, people did not fully understand the science of fermentation. They could not see the yeasts at work, but they knew that once the juice rested, it began to bubble, hiss, and transform into something far greater than grape juice. To them, it was a gift of God, a miracle hidden in the fruit itself, a natural magic that turned sweetness into strength. Fermentation vessels. The must was poured into large wooden barrels, clay amphorae, or massive stone vats, depending on the region and resources. Monasteries often had the finest barrels made from seasoned oak, while peasants relied on clay jars sealed with cloth or wax. Each vessel carried with it a unique influence on the wine, lending flavors of earth, wood, or stone. The bubbling process, within days, the must came alive. Foam rose to the surface, bubbles hissed and popped, and a sweet, yeasty smell filled the air. Workers skimmed off the thick cap of skins and seeds, stirring the liquid with heavy wooden paddles to ensure the transformation stayed even. This bubbling, violent stage was the heartbeat of winemaking, when nature took control. Monitoring the fermentation. Though they lacked thermometers or scientific instruments, winemakers relied on their senses. They listened to the bubbling, watched the thickness of the foam, tasted the liquid daily, and smelled its progress. Too long, and the wine would sour. Too short, and it would be weak. Generations of intuition guided the hands of those who watched over the vats. Length of fermentation. Fermentation could last anywhere from several days to a few weeks, depending on weather, grape quality, and tradition. In colder climates, the process slowed, sometimes stalling altogether, while in warmer regions it rushed quickly, producing stronger wines. Patience was as important as skill, and the community waited eagerly for the signal that the wine was ready to be drawn, the sacred transformation. For many in the 16th century, fermentation carried spiritual weight. Monks compared the bubbling of the juice to the stirring of the soul, a transformation that could only be achieved through time and faith. What emerged from the vat was no longer mere grape juice, but wine, a drink that nourished, inspired, and connected earth to heaven. Racking and storage, separating the wine one. The need for racking. Once fermentation slowed, the young wine was not yet ready to drink. Sediment, called lees, settled at the bottom of the barrels or jars, skins, seeds, and yeast that could spoil the taste if left too long. Winemakers of the 16th century knew the importance of removing this, even if they didn't understand the science. For them, clarity and purity came from patience and care. The first racking. To separate wine from its sediment, workers carefully siphoned or poured the liquid into new vessels. This was delicate work. Every drop had to be preserved while avoiding the thick sludge at the bottom. Clay jugs, wooden ladles, and narrow spouts were used with steady hands. The clear wine sparkled faintly as it flowed into fresh casks, leaving the murky dregs behind. Barrels and storage. The finest wines were stored in oak barrels, sealed with wax or resin to prevent leaking. Peasants who could not afford oak often used clay amphorae buried in cool ground, or stone cellars where the air stayed damp and cold. Barrels were stacked neatly in shadowy chambers, the smell of oak, earth, and wine mingling together. The cellar itself became part of the wine's character. The role of time. Time was the invisible craftsman of wine. Weeks, months, even years in storage allowed flavors to deepen. Some wines were meant to be drunk young, while others rested until noble households or monasteries decided they had reached perfection. Dust gathered on the barrels, spiders spun webs in corners, and all the while the wine matured silently in the dark. Protecting the wine storage brought risks. If the barrel cracked or the seal failed, the wine might sour into vinegar. If thieves broke in, months of labor could be lost in a night. For this reason, cellars were guarded carefully, sometimes locked with iron doors, especially in monasteries where wine held both sacred and economic value. Protection was as important as patience. The waiting reward. The people who harvested, crushed, and labored often waited many months before tasting the fruit of their effort. But when the time finally came, the clear, rich wine that poured from the barrel was more than drink. It was survival, celebration, and spirit, the essence of the vineyard, preserved through skill and time. Wine was no longer simply fruit juice. It had become history in liquid form, aging and flavor. The waiting game. Why wine was aged. Not all wine was meant to be drunk young. The finest wines of the 16th century were aged deliberately, left to rest in barrels, clay jars, or stone cellars. Time softened the sharpness of the liquid, deepened its color, and brought out hidden flavors. To age wine was to trust patience, a risk that often led to greater reward. Influence of the vessel. The vessel shaped the character of the wine. Oak barrels gave a smoky, woody taste, while clay amphorae imparted earthy tones. Stone vats kept wine cool and clean. Nobles and monasteries could afford carefully crafted oak casks, while villagers relied on simpler methods. Each choice of vessel was like adding a signature to the final drink. The role of cellars. Dark, cool, and damp, the cellar was the perfect place for wine to age. The air smelled of earth, wood, and slow transformation. Barrels lay stacked in silence, some forgotten for years, others checked regularly. Cobwebs gathered, candles burned low, and still the wine slept, slowly becoming richer with each passing season. The patience of aging weeks turned to months, months to years. Families waited through harsh winters and hot summers while the wine rested in its vessel. Some wines were opened after a single season, but the greatest were saved for weddings, feasts, or sacred offerings. Time was the silent craftsman, shaping the wine with every heartbeat of the earth. Flavors emerging with time. As the wine aged, its flavors unfolded. Harsh edges softened into warmth, bitterness melted into depth, and the liquid grew round, complex, and full-bodied. To taste aged wine was to taste history itself, the vineyard, the weather, the soil, and the patient hands of those who waited for perfection. The symbol of aged wine was more than a drink. It was a mark of wealth, wisdom, and status. To offer aged wine was to show power and refinement. For monasteries, it symbolized devotion and discipline. For peasants, rare aged wine was a treasure, a reminder that even time itself could be captured in a cup. Serving and drinking, celebration of wine. The first pour. When the wine was finally ready, the moment of the first pour carried great weight. The winemaker drew liquid from the barrel into a jug or goblet, raising it to the light to admire its clarity and deep color. This was more than a test. It was the reward for months of labor, prayers, and patience. Wine at the peasant's table. For common villagers, wine was everyday sustenance, often weaker and mixed with water to stretch supplies. It was shared with bread, cheese, and stews at wooden tables, families drinking together after long hours in the fields. Crude clay cups clinked softly, laughter filled small cottages, and the drink reminded them that even in hardship, there was joy to be found. Wine in noble banquets. For nobles, wine was a display of wealth and refinement. Long banquet tables groaned under roasted meats, golden platters, and goblets of shimmering wine. Servants refilled cups as music echoed through candlelit halls. The aged vintages were reserved for lords, ladies, and honored guests, each sip a symbol of status and celebration. Wine in monasteries. In monasteries, wine held a sacred role. It was part of the Eucharist, symbolizing the blood of Christ, and was also used for medicine and hospitality. Monks drank it modestly, often in silence, giving thanks for the harvest and the divine mystery within each cup. To them, wine was not indulgence, but devotion. Wine in festivals. Wine also flowed freely during village festivals. Jugs were passed from hand to hand, songs rose into the night, and fires burned while dancers stamped their feet on the earth. The drink became a unifier, dissolving class, age, and burden. In those moments, the entire community shared the same cup, the same joy, the same spirit of celebration. The symbol of wine in life? Wine in the 16th century was more than a beverage. It was survival for peasants, prestige for nobles, sacred offering for monks, and celebration for all. To drink wine was to taste the vineyard, the soil, the sun, and the patience of time. Each cup carried history, culture, and spirit, a reminder that even in a world of hardship, beauty could be savored.